He is the most dangerous human being that I've ever come into contact with. This was about excessive violence. For him, taking somebody's life in order to take property off them is totally justifiable.
This is the story of the extraordinary hunt for a serial killer who evaded justice for almost a quarter of a century.
Take a look at the sea, look, maybe.
The case is at the heart of the major ITV drama, The Pembrokeshire Murders.
The search for justice for these victims is such a gritty, intense, immersive story.
This actually happens to people. It's not a made-up story. It's not fantasy. This is reality.
Now we bring together the real people who brought this killer to justice. A specialist team determined to unlock forensic secrets which had remained undiscovered for decades.
Every contact leaves a trace. It's just whether or not we're clever enough to find it.
And who turned to a TV game show for the final crucial evidence.
I've never seen a comparison between an artist's impression and that of a suspect. It was like a tracing.
This was a race against time.
I am not a murderer.
To catch a killer.
I was in no doubt that Cooper would kill again.
This was a guy that was never going to stop.
Pembrokeshire is an area of outstanding natural beauty. Beautiful coastline. And it is a place where people come and spend the holidays. It's an area which is very, very close to my heart, an area that I love, an area which I lived in. If you've got to choose somewhere to live in the UK, then Pembrokeshire should be top of the list.
Beautiful countryside with a terrible secret.
Pembrokeshire was a quiet little place, and yet we had someone that had been capable of such horrendous crimes.
Somewhere in this rural idyll, a serial killer stalked. In the 1980s, 4 innocent people were blasted to death with a shotgun. For more than 20 years, the crimes remained unsolved.
Those crimes cast a shadow over Pembrokeshire,
More than 60 police officers.
and 2 double murders were a big cloud over the force.
In here, then, we've got the main bulk of the staff.
Encouraged by developments in forensic science, Dyfed-Powys Police brought together a small hand-picked team of detectives to take a fresh look at the
What
murders.
I'll do today is just to give you a brief background, and then later on...
The top-secret operation was codenamed Ottawa.
I am Stephen Wilkins. I was the Senior Investigating Officer for Operation Ottawa. Cold case reviews nationally had moved on, particularly with forensic science. There'd been a considerable amount of success, so it's very, very important that serious cases are reviewed.
The Ottawa team had to go back to the very beginning, when the murders began. In December 1985, fire ripped through a secluded manor house belonging to Richard Thomas and his sister Helen.
My name is Don Evans, former Detective Chief Superintendent of Dyfed-Powys Police. 3 days before Christmas, on a Sunday night, I was at my home when my control room telephoned me to say that there was a large fire at Scoviston Park near Stainton, Milford Haven. When I arrived, the fire was so extensive that everything had fallen through from the roof onto an area where I saw the body of Richard Thomas burning, partly burnt, clothes round him burning. There was an area on the abdomen which had not been burnt in the fire. That's where I saw this circular wound. I thought at that time that it was a shotgun wound.
The body of Richard's sister Helen was eventually found in debris from an upper floor which had come crashing down through the burnt-out manor house.
The remains of Helen's body had gunshot wounds, and she had black rope round her neck.
Initial inquiries began to reveal a terrifying scenario. Police were to discover that Helen Thomas had been alone when the killer arrived. She'd been tied up, possibly sexually assaulted, and then shot. When Richard returned, he too had been shot. The intruder then started a fire to cover their tracks, and it worked. Scenes of crime officers spent weeks sieving through the wreck of the house, but found nothing to lead them to the killer.
It went on for a long time without success. I thought possibly it was committed by someone quite close to the locality.
Every house in the rural villages around Scotstoun Park was called on by police. One man interviewed was 41-year-old John Cooper, a handyman with convictions for violence in his youth.
Cooper was interviewed. He was strongly alibied by his family, who it would appear was terrified of him, said that he was home all night, that it was a wet night, and that he hadn't gone out. And officers took him out of the inquiry. At that time, we were nowhere near close to solving it. It was alarming for everyone. Their main questions were, do you think it'll happen again? And I obviously was trying to instill in the public that no, it won't happen again. But I was keeping my fingers crossed, everything crossed. I had gone away on a week's holiday, returned on the Monday morning to be informed, quite coolly, that a couple at Little Haven, they are missing.
Peter and Gwenda Dixon were last seen alive last Friday. They left their tent and car at a campsite near Little Haven and set out to walk along the coast path to Dale.
I heard, "Boss, come quickly." My heart jumped and I ran along the coastal path to the two dog handlers, through the undergrowth, right down to the cliff edge. And there I saw this horrible scene. Peter and Gwenda Dixon. Peter shot, tied, and his dear lady, partly unclothed, shot 5 shots. The most horrific sight you'd ever see, the worst I've ever seen. It was an assassination. And here we had another major incident, a double murder in the county of Pembrokeshire. Horrific.
Timothy Dixon spoke of the last time he'd seen his parents. He'd called in on them at the campsite where they were staying, and how he'd raised the alarm when he realised that they hadn't returned home.
Why don't you just give yourselves up to the police? How can you live with yourselves with what you've done to my parents?
While officers had no idea about who might be responsible, there was one lead.
Mr. Dixon's credit cards were then used at cash card machines around the area. Officers have so far questioned over 18,000 people and taken some 6,000 witness statements.
A witness came forward, and this sketch was produced of the man seen using Peter Dixon's cash card at a local bank. The figure in the sketch became known as the Wild Man due to his unkempt appearance. The man was almost certainly the killer, but despite widespread appeals, there were no new leads.
Thousands of people were interviewed, significant inquiries were made in relation to that, unfortunately without a result.
The killer had slipped through the net again. But the murders were not the only unsolved serious crimes worrying detectives.
I'm Glenn Johnson, Detective Inspector from the Operation Ottawa investigation.
For more than a decade, this rural area of Wales had been dogged by a series of burglaries.
The burglaries were of property all within the Pembrokeshire area, backing onto fields, jewellery, items of value were stolen.
These continued into the 1990s when police set up a major operation to catch the culprit.
During a house-to-house inquiry, a number of exhibits were recovered that were identified as stolen from these burglaries.
The house belonged to John Cooper, the handyman who had been questioned about the murders of Richard and Helen Thomas in Scoveston 13 years earlier. A detailed search of his house, grounds, and a nearby lake uncovered a buried shotgun, more than 50 ropes, and stolen jewellery. In December 1998, Cooper was jailed for 16 years, having been found guilty of 30 burglaries and 1 robbery. The press dubbed him the super burglar. During the trial, there had been suspicion that he might also have been involved in the shotgun murders.
I'm not a murderer. I'm not a murderer. I am not a murderer.
And Cooper got away with the killings. Cooper was 8 years into his sentence when the Ottawa team was brought together.
It was kept very, very tight, positioned in an office in Fishguard Port. Cooper was in prison at the time, and we certainly didn't want him, make him aware that we were reviewing the 2 murders.
The sheer scale of an investigation which covered evidence from 4 murders and a number of burglaries was daunting.
There was 5 computerised incident rooms. There was 1 old-fashioned paper-based incident room.
11,000 exhibits and over 1 million documents that we had to review before we could even think about whether that was going to end up in a trial or not.
But from day one, I felt that we would find the person responsible, that we would find the truth. The evidence is always there, but you've just got to find it.
But could they link Cooper, the super burglar, to the murders? It now seemed that another terrible crime which took place about 3 miles from Cooper's home might hold fresh clues.
That night, their childhood was taken from them. It was a really terrible attack.
In 2006, a small team of detectives was on the trail of a serial killer who had evaded justice for 20 years, and they had a prime suspect. John Cooper was in jail for burglary, but detectives believed clues to the murders might lie in another terrible crime, which had taken place close to his home while he was still free. In 1996, a man wearing a balaclava and armed with a shotgun confronted 5 teenagers in a field near Milford Haven.
The Milford Haven attack was, for me, was very, very important. It took place in March 1996. 5 children went out into a field, a nice sunny evening, and then they're confronted by a masked man with a sawn-off shotgun. Then he takes one of the young females away from the group, where he rapes her, and then he indecently assaults a second female.
They were in a position where they'd made the wrong movement or tried to get away. Had he have shot one, he could potentially have shot all of them then. They were terrified and feared for their safety, feared for their lives.
That night, their childhood was taken from them. It was a really terrible attack.
Steve Wilkins believed the rapist with the balaclava and shotgun was also the man behind the Scoverston and Coast Path murders. He was convinced that man was John Cooper.
For me, the attack at Milford Haven actually tied those two murders together. When you looked at geographically, proximity to Scoverston Park, you could actually see Scoverston Park from the scene where the 5 children were attacked. Within 5 miles, we'd also had the murders of Peter and Gwenda Dixon on the Coastal Path, again where robbery, a sexual element, the use of rope and a shotgun was used. To me, that was beyond coincidental.
With the circumstantial case against Cooper building, Steve Wilkins decided to go public with an appeal for information.
Cooper, who at that stage is in prison, was an avid watcher of ITV Wales for the news. Therefore, there was a good chance that he would see a public appeal, and I wanted to know what reaction that had.
Steve Wilkins contacted a journalist who was fascinated by the case.
I'm Jonathan Hill, a journalist with ITV News, and I followed the Ottawa investigation from start to finish.
Jonathan Hill had been on holiday in the Little Haven area as a teenager in 1989 during the search for the Dixons killer.
I remember there were posters everywhere. It was an area I loved and knew really, really well, you know, from a young teenager, and it really had quite a profound effect on me. And I was always interested in news, but particularly interested in this unsolved double murder.
Good evening. We're live in Pembrokeshire, where there have been dramatic developments.
The Dixons and the Thomases were blasted to death with a shotgun in the 1980s. Now the cases are being re-investigated. Tonight...
We did the broadcast on the Coastal Path, not far from where the Dixons had been murdered. It was important to be there because I think we wanted to jog people's memories about the crime, because a huge amount of time had elapsed, some sort of 17, 18 years.
As a team, we feel that there is a very real chance that somebody watching this programme tonight may have significant information or indeed know who is responsible.
And I just got that sense that Steve was absolutely directing all he had to say, a very careful message to John Cooper.
I want to unnerve him. I want him to sit there and think, what have they got? Have they got evidence already that ties me to it? The objectives and focus of Operation Ottawa is to carry out a comprehensive review of all the forensic material recovered in both cases.
I think there was a bit of bluff, actually, in what Steve was doing, because at that time, what they had was loads of exhibits which they believed would give them the clues, but at that moment, they didn't actually have any forensic evidence. But Steve doesn't give that impression, and that was all tailored to be at Cooper's door. Once the story broke, everybody was chasing it. Witnesses who, after all that time, still rang up and said they'd seen this wild man of Pembrokeshire.
The day after we made the appeal, Cooper's chosen reading was failed cases on DNA, so it did have an impact on Cooper. Over that way then, again, when it's elevated, you'll see.
But despite all their suspicions about Cooper, detectives had no forensic evidence to put him at the scene of the murders. The Ottawa team wondered if they may already be sitting on the evidence they needed. A large number of items had been recovered from Cooper's house in Operation Huntsman when he was arrested for the burglaries in 1998.
He kept mementos of his offending, and I felt that was part of his MO, is that reminded him at that moment when he held a person's life in his hands.
Could it be that the forensic answers lay in items Cooper hoarded from his crimes? Steve Wilkins called on one of Britain's foremost forensic scientists.
I'm Dr. Angela Gallop, and I led the forensic science team. It is such an interesting case. It's right up there. It's like Rachel Nickell, Damilola Taylor, Stephen Lawrence, all of these cases that I think people had given up on, really, in terms of being able to solve. Steve Wilkins said at the beginning of our investigation, he said, all I need is a golden nugget. It's a golden, that's all I need of DNA. And I think I and the rest of the team thought, yeah, you do. Let's see what we can find.
While Angela Gallop began the painstaking work of examining the items seized from Cooper's home, there was worrying news for the Ottawa team.
He'd served almost 10 years of his prison sentence. He was about to be released on parole. And I'd got no doubt he'd start his offending again. And there would only be one end to that. Cooper would kill again.
We knew that this was a guy that wasn't returning to society to live a quiet life. This was a guy that was never going to stop.
Welcome home, love.
Cooper Goins back on his first night back at home. I was actually the senior investigating officer on call, and I received a call from our control room at around about 3:30 in the morning. Annika remembered the exact words. Boss, we think he's murdered his wife. I can tell you that that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was a very sad story with Pat Cooper because she'd suffered years and years of physical and mental abuse. Pat probably was aware of issues which would have assisted us, but I think her fear, and well-placed fear of Cooper, stopped her ever imparting that information to us. So she was terrified of the man.
But the cause of Pat's death on the night of Cooper's release was not what police first feared.
Pat had chronic heart disease, and she actually died of natural causes. That is the medical explanation. I believe that Pat Cooper just gave up.
Cooper's release increased the pressure to secure forensic evidence against him. Experts started to make a detailed analysis of the items recovered from his home in 1998, when he was arrested for the burglaries in Operation Huntsman.
The officers had seized a number of items of clothing, a pair of shorts being one of them. Taking into account the artist's impression from the Coastal Path murders, and that artist's impression showed him wearing a pair of shorts.
So we were examining the shorts for fibres when we noticed that there was a tiny flake of blood, or what looked like a tiny flake of blood on it. And we DNA profiled it, and we got a result.
After double-checking the test result, it was time to break the news to Steve Wilkins.
And I remember I rang him, and he was driving his car at the time, and I thought, well, this is going to come as quite a shock to him. I said, just pull in somewhere, and then I'll talk you through where we've got to.
Okay, what is it?
Right, so we unpicked the hem of the shorts, like you asked.
And she said, Steve, we found a small stain. We've tested that stain. And it's tested positive for the blood of Peter Dixon. And its discriminating value is 1 in 1 billion.
We were pretty sure that that could be classed as a golden nugget.
Through further forensic analysis of the Huntsman exhibits, the team discovered that the shorts also linked Cooper to the Scoveston double murder of Richard and Helen Thomas in 1985.
A lot of Richard Thomas's clothing had been destroyed. There was one sock that hadn't been destroyed, and it was extraordinary. We managed to find 2 different kinds of fibres linking the sock with the pocket of John Cooper's shorts.
Finally, the team had some forensic evidence to link Cooper to all 4 murders. But could they also prove that Cooper was the masked man who raped a teenage girl in Milford Haven? During his spree of burglaries, Cooper had attacked a woman at her home in the small village of Sardis. The robbery did not go to plan.
During that armed robbery, he attacked a lone female in a house, and as he moved around the house searching for property, cash and jewellery, she managed to set an alarm off.
Cooper fled the scene. In an attempt to avoid capture, he threw items of his crime kit into the hedgerows.
We were fortunate from the Sardis robbery to have recovered the balaclava, the gloves that he was wearing at the time, and a shotgun.
The discarded glove was to be a forensic treasure trove. Its fibres were recovered from items in Cooper's workshop, proving it was his. They were also found on branches used to cover the bodies of Peter and Gwenda Dixon, and on evidence from the scene of the Milford Haven rape.
This muddy glove that had been recovered from a hedgerow that links with the Dixons, with Cooper's home address, with the Milford Haven crime, that is the central item, I think, of the whole case.
So we now connected him to 4 murders, a rape, and indecent assault, beyond our wildest dreams.
Finally, the Ottawa detectives believed they had unravelled the 20-year-old mystery of the Pembrokeshire serial killer.
He's kicked off. He's kicked off.
But they knew Cooper would do everything he could to continue to evade justice.
You're making things try to fit to John Cooper, and it's bloody annoying.
John Cooper believed he had got away with 4 cold-blooded murders in rural Pembrokeshire. But police were closing in and ready to make an arrest.
He will be arrested this morning on suspicion of 4 murders, the armed robbery and the rape offence.
More than 20 years after the murders at Scoverston Park, detectives believe they finally had the evidence to bring Cooper to justice.
He's kicked off. He's kicked off.
Dyfed-Powys Police said a local man has been arrested in connection with both double murders and a serious sexual assault and attempted robbery in Milford Haven.
Now detectives had to go face-to-face with Cooper and break down his lies.
Will you tell me what happened on the 29th of June, 1989, in Little Haven? My name is Gareth Rees, a former detective sergeant in the Dyfed-Powys Police Force. I was one of the officers who interviewed John Cooper. He was a nasty individual, even in the family environment. They all lived in fear of him. When he was on a farm, he killed a pig with a hammer, and that when his children were small, they reared some chicks, and he shot them with a shotgun in front of them.
Detectives focused their questions on a pair of khaki shorts recovered from Cooper's home. These were shorter than those in the artist's impression of the man seen using the Dixons' bank cards after the murders. But Peter Dixon's DNA had been found on them.
During the interviews, we were given the task, try and get him to admit they're his own shorts. Would you accept that those shorts resemble the shorts in the artist's impression?
Not a bit, no.
Okay. He said that the shorts worn by the person in the artist's impression were long-legged shorts, but his bathers were short-legged shorts. Have you ever seen the shorts in this photograph, TWB1, before?
I believe those are my bathers, actually.
Okay. When you've shown the photograph, I asked, have you seen those before, John? And he said, they look like my bathers. Okay. So do you accept that those shorts are yours?
Yes, those might have been my bathers.
Oh, your bathers. Right. I knew then that he'd associated himself with one of the most crucial pieces of evidence we had. The shorts were sent away for forensic examination, and the reply that we had back was that they had been shortened post-manufacture by an amateur.
What we did know that Pat Cooper was a seamstress, so it is likely that Pat Cooper had shortened those shorts.
During yesterday's interview, John,
Yes.
you mentioned that during the trial you handled a shotgun.
Oh, a shotgun was in the court, yes, I believe it was, yes. The shotgun used in the robbery that I was convicted of.
In Sardis?
Yeah.
Cooper seemed preoccupied with the shotgun he used during the Sardis robbery in 1996. It had been part of the evidence against him at his trial 2 years later.
It was quite clear he was concerned about that gun. So why worry about a gun for which you've already been convicted?
I believe I handled the one in the court case that I was in court for.
And it's at that stage that another eureka moment where, as a team, we realised that that was the murder weapon. It was up to us now to identify trace evidence on it to connect it to the offences. There was black paint on the barrels, and that looks like that had been hand painted on, probably to take away the reflective nature of the barrels.
As we looked at the packaging and got the gun out of the packaging and so on, we noticed that in the bottom of the packaging there were all these little flakes, black flakes, and so obviously the paint was flaking off. I seem to remember we had a low-power microscope with a strong light, and you could see that there was a reddish cast on them on the inner surface. And of course, quick as a flash, we get our blood reagents out and we discover that it's actually blood.
They found the blood of Peter Dixon on the barrel and on the breech of the shotgun. We now had the murder weapon.
Every contact, absolutely, I'm sure, leaves a trace. It's just whether or not we're clever enough to find it.
The fact is, John, that the net has been slowly closing in around you, and with the latest forensic results, it's provided us with strong evidence. I think he could see then that the cards were stacking up against him, and he was in trouble.
Everything my colleague has put to you today, it all comes back to you. And that is why you were here today, isn't it?
Because that's your outlook of every damn thing. Oh, yes. Put them all onto John Cooper because that's good and proper.
And at that stage, we can then start to see the real John Cooper come out. He starts to become angry.
You're making things try to fit to John Cooper, and it's bloody annoying.
He starts to become agitated. He starts to point to the camera and says, "I know you, all of you in there."
You all and your colleagues and them in there choose not to believe it, to look elsewhere.
Through years of painstaking work, detectives had built up a compelling case against John Cooper. But Steve Wilkins felt there was still one missing piece to connect Cooper to the murders.
What we didn't have was a photograph of Cooper, which we could confidently say was how he looked at that time to compare it with the artist impression.
The answer lay in an unlikely place.
We were aware that Cooper had been on Bullseye from quite an early stage, but what we didn't know was what the significance of his appearance on Bullseye could be.
On Bullseye.
It was this legendary game show hosted by Jim Bowen, hugely popular, and the contestants had to answer general knowledge questions and then also play darts to win the prizes.
26
and Steve said, look, any chance you can see if you can find this?
Black.
It was like looking for a needle in a haystack because they made countless episodes of Bullseye. They're still running on channels now.
Who would you like to be if you weren't you?
My husband, because he didn't work as hard as I do.
I had to get hold of an archivist who was looking after the shows. They were all stored in a basement in Leeds. And it required a bit of sweet talking and a bit of arm bending to get him to go through all the episodes and look for a contestant that was from Pembrokeshire.
Listen, what you'd like to...
There was no list of the contestants on ITV records. The archivist hunted through videotapes of hundreds of programmes.
I got a call from the archivist who said, I think I found it.
John and Harvey with £220, please.
He said, there's a guy here, and he's with a friend, and they're from Pembrokeshire. And I can remember thinking, well, it was an amazing moment to think we'd found it.
You've got an unusual hobby, John, haven't you?
Oh, yes, the scuba diving.
The scuba diving. And apparently it's the place to do it down there, isn't it?
Oh, we've got the coastline.
Because
I get a call from a very excited Jonathan Hill, and they've actually identified the particular programme and the recording. And significantly, it is 3 weeks before the Dixons are murdered.
We'd like to go.
There it is. I'll keep...
We just took the artist's impression, and then we took a freeze frame, just like you do at home on a DVD player. You know, you press pause at the most likely moment.
Get the £220 back. We know you're a good player. Just hope
and suddenly, those two images came together.
It was unbelievable. In my 33 years in the police, I've never seen a comparison between an artist's impression and that of a suspect. It was like a tracing.
There he was, on bullseye, just a month before he killed the Dixons.
The Ottawa detectives were ready to charge Cooper with 4 murders and a rape.
Judge me after the trial, not before.
But now everything rested with a jury.
I am not a murderer. I am not a rapist.
Had we got this man at last? Had the police got him?
Do you find the defendant, John William Cooper, guilty or not guilty?
The atmosphere in the court was, you could have cut it with a knife.
After more than 20 years of evading justice, John Cooper was finally facing trial for murder.
You must judge me after the trial, not before. Judge me after the trial.
Over the years, I've had total control of the investigation. So it's a real strange feeling that you're handing over that investigation to people that you've never ever met before.
I believed that if we didn't secure a conviction against him, then he would kill again.
One of the country's top barristers took on the task of leading the prosecution against Cooper.
I'm Gerard Elias QC, prosecuting counsel at the trial of John Cooper at Swansea Crown Court.
Imagine the sequence of events, ladies and gentlemen. The defendant shoots the Dixons at close range. He then moves their bodies and covers them with branches.
I certainly had not been involved in a trial before where there were 3 separate but complex and hugely important matters. And of course, the evidence of one supported the evidence of the other.
This man in the photograph is the real John Cooper, a loving husband who was married to his wife for 42 years. I am not a murderer. I am not a rapist. I am an innocent man who has been wronged. Thank you.
Cooper gave his evidence, and then we normally concluded the day around about 4:30. And the trial judge asked Gerard Elias QC as to whether he wanted to wait and start his interview in the morning.
Mr. Elias, it's 4:45. Are you content to begin your cross-examination of Mr. Cooper tomorrow?
If my lord would permit, I would like to have a few minutes with Mr. Cooper.
Very well, Mr. Elias.
Thank you, my lord.
I didn't really want a jury going home even beginning to think that this represented the man that they were trying in any shape or form.
I would like to ask you a few questions about the balaclava which was discovered under the hedgerow near the scene of the Sardis robbery.
At the previous trial, he said the balaclava was not mine, it had been stolen.
Do you accept that the balaclava is yours?
Yes.
Therefore, at the previous trial, he must have been telling lies to the jury.
So you admit that in 1998, you lied to that jury?
Yes, but...
Thank you, my lord.
The atmosphere in the court, you could have cut it with a knife. The next morning, Mr. Elias said, "We've now established you're a liar." And the impact that must have had on the jury was significant. It was something that will remain with me forever.
If there had been created any illusion, here was a man who could actually be a gentleman, that illusion was now pretty well shattered.
The defendant has always maintained that this police artist's impression, based on a witness sighting, bears no resemblance to himself as he was in the summer of 1989. But due to an extraordinary quirk of fate, 1 month before the Coastal Path murders, his likeness was captured on video during his appearance on a game show on national television. The resulting image speaks volumes.
Well, here's the photograph drawn by the artist, and here he is on the Bullseye programme. I mean, it is the same person. One sees the jury out of the corner of one's eye. I mean, they obviously didn't say it out loud, but you could feel them saying, obviously, obviously.
I'm not a murderer. I am not a murderer.
The jury in the trial of John Cooper has retired to begin considering its verdict after weeks of evidence.
Now begins the tense wait for a verdict. Tense for all the relatives that have been coming to court every day, and of course for the defendant himself, John William Cooper.
The police, the experts had done a fantastic job, particularly given the time that had elapsed since the commission of the offences and so on.
Let's have the jury in, please.
But again, one never quite knows with a jury whether they do see it in the same way. Had we got this man at last? Had the police got him?
On count 1 of the indictment, the murder of Helen Thomas, do you find the defendant, John William Cooper, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Guilty. On count 2 of the indictment, the murder of Richard Thomas, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Guilty. On count 3 of the indictment, the murder of Gwenda Dixon, guilty or not guilty?
When the verdicts came in, I was actually down in Pembrokeshire on the Coastal Path, very short distance from where the Dixons were murdered. And I remember getting a text from Steve, and it said, guilty, all counts. It was quite profound to be at that place where such terrible crimes had happened, looking down at the scene. When I got that text, it's a moment I'll never forget.
Good evening and welcome to a special programme on the day Wales' most notorious serial killer was finally unmasked. We're live in Pembrokeshire, where John Cooper terrorised this community for more than 15 years, murdering, raping and robbing.
It's a cold, controlled evil that I think I saw in Cooper, which I don't remember in anyone else that I've been involved with.
It's a bittersweet sort of feeling. Yes, we did have success, but it was on the success of a lot of pain and trauma from victims and victims' families.
To many, our mum and dad are just another two faces that happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But to our family, they are irreplaceable. They had wisdom, humour, and were compassionate. Even after 2 decades, their absence is immense and still painful.
We were always left asking the question, were there other victims? With a killer like Cooper, who was so prolific, why would he stop?
Flo Evans lived here on a small holding.
And I remember Steve saying to me he believed that there was another victim. And when I trawled through the archive, I came across this rather curious story.
Flo Evans lived here on a small holding less than 2 miles from Scoveston. Flo Evans lived here on a small holding less than 2 miles from Scoveston Park. The 72-year-old, who was still fit and active, was found dead, fully clothed in a bath full of water.
Flo Evans. Cooper knew her. Cooper was her sort of handyman, and yet she died in a very mysterious way. The reporter at the time had speculated that Flo Evans lived just a short distance from Scoveston Park, where 2 people had been brutally murdered.
Cooper always committed offences where he felt safe. He committed offences where he had a connection to.
An inquest decided that the death must have been accidental because there was no sign of forced entry at the house. But friends and neighbours disagreed. Normally, Mrs. Evans only locked her inner back door, but when her body was found, the outer door was locked instead. The bath had been filled with water, even though it would have been stone cold, because the fire heating the back boiler was not lit.
The family suggested there was items of property missing from the house, including shotguns. With hindsight and knowing Cooper as an offender, this should have been a murder inquiry.
The widow herself was buried alongside her husband in the local cemetery. Her death destined always to be a mystery.
There was no evidence at the end of the day, with no material that we could examine, but the death of Florence Evans does disturb me greatly.